The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the embassy ballroom, and in the sudden silence that followed, my husband's voice rang out clear and cold in perfect Mandarin. Please forgive my wife. She's from a rural background. Her Chinese has always been an embarrassment. I stood frozen in my red kipao, the traditional dress I'd spent hours selecting for this diplomatic reception, watching as 300 pairs of eyes turned toward me. The Chinese ambassador's wife offered a tight, pitying smile. My husband, Marcus Chen, born Mark Chen in suburban Connecticut, who'd learned Mandarin from a tutor at age 25, placed a proprietary hand on my lower back and guided me away from the conversation I'd been having in flawless, unaccented Mandarin about classical poetry with one of China's most influential cultural ministers. My accent. He'd said my accent was embarrassing. I was born in Chengdu. Mandarin was my first language. I'd been speaking it before I could walk, learned poetry at my grandmother's knee, could recite Tang Dynasty verses in my sleep. But my husband, who stumbled over tones and mixed up his measure words, had just publicly humiliated me in front of the people who would determine his next promotion. The minister's eyes had flickered with confusion, then understanding, then something like contempt, not for me, but for Marcus. But the damage was done. As we rode home in silence, I stared at my reflection in the car window and remembered every moment that had led here. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of watching him correct my broken English in front of his colleagues while his own grammar crumbled under scrutiny. 7 years of him taking credit for translations I'd done, for cultural insights I'd provided, for connections I'd made. 7 years of him insisting I was lucky he'd married me, given me citizenship, given me a better life. 7 years of slowly, systematically erasing who I was. We pulled into the garage of our Georgetown townhouse, the one his salary alone could never have afforded, the one my inheritance from my grandmother had purchased, though the deed bore only his name. He'd convinced me it was simpler that way, for taxes. You need to be more careful, he said, not looking at me as he loosened his tie. Your accent gets thicker when you're nervous. It reflects poorly on both of us. My accent. My native accent in my native language. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that the minister had been impressed, that we'd been discussing Wang Wei's poetry, that he'd invited me to a private literary salon next month. I wanted to tell him that his own Mandarin was so obviously American that every native speaker we met struggled not to wince. But I'd learned years ago that defending myself only made things worse. I'm sorry, I whispered instead in English, with the flat Midwestern accent I'd worked so hard to perfect. I'll do better. He nodded satisfied and went to his study. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, sat at my vanity, and stared at my reflection. At 32, I looked older than my years. The light had gone out of my eyes. When had that happened? My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Your sister's engagement party is next month. You will come, yes? And bring your successful husband. My sister, Jennifer. Or, as she'd been named at birth, Jingjing. She'd changed it at 16 the moment she'd left for college, shedding her Chinese name like an unwanted skin. Now she worked in fashion, spoke only English, pretended our parents had been born in California instead of immigrating when we were children. She'd always looked down on me for clinging to the old ways, for speaking Mandarin at home, for cooking Sichuan food, for caring about our heritage. And when I'd married Marcus, successful, ambitious, Chinese-American Marcus, she'd been furious that I'd caught him instead of her. The irony was suffocating. I set down my phone and opened my jewelry box, pulling out the jade bracelet my grandmother had given me before she died. Leonor, she'd said, using my Chinese name, the one Marcus refused to pronounce, insisting on Lily instead. This has been passed down for 5 generations. Wear it always and remember who you are. But I'd forgotten, hadn't I? Piece by piece, word by word, I'd let them all convince me that who I was wasn't good enough. I went to bed that night with tears soaking my pillow, my husband snoring beside me, oblivious. And then I didn't wake up. The heart attack was sudden, the doctor said later. A genetic defect no one had detected. I was only 32. Marcus gave a beautiful eulogy in English, mentioning my brave journey from poverty in China, even though my family had been comfortably middle class, even though I'd come to America on a graduate school scholarship. My sister cried prettily in the front row, dressed in white instead of the traditional mourning colors, and told everyone how she'd tried so hard to help me adapt. My parents, broken by grief, returned to their small apartment in Queens and never spoke of me again, the pain too great. But I knew none of this at the time because I was experiencing something impossible. I was dying, and then I was opening my eyes to see my childhood bedroom ceiling in Chengdu. My grandmother's face appeared above me, younger than I'd seen her in decades, her eyes crinkled with laughter. Liana, you lazy girl, it's past 9. Your entrance exam is today. Entrance exam. I sat up, my mind reeling. I was in my childhood bed, in my childhood body. My hands were smooth and unwrinkled, my limbs gangly with teenage growth. On my desk, I could see my high school textbooks, my acceptance letter to Beijing Normal University, the one I'd attended before grad school in America, before I'd met Marcus at a conference, before everything. I was 16 again, and I remembered everything. The next hours passed in a blur of shock and confirmation. The date on the calendar, June 7th, my birth year plus 16. The exam was for the final English language certification I'd needed. My grandmother hustled me through breakfast, chattering about how this test would determine my university placement, how proud she was of my admission. I walked to the testing center in a daze, my mind spinning with impossible knowledge. I'd lived 17 years beyond this day. I'd gone to university, earned my master's, moved to America, married, suffered, died, and now I was here again. During the exam, I filled in the answers mechanically, my adult mind finding the high school English questions absurdly simple. But my thoughts were elsewhere, racing through memories, analyzing everything with the cruel clarity of hindsight. Marcus, my sister, my parents who'd grown distant when I'd married up and away, the slow erosion of my identity, the way I'd been so grateful for his attention that I'd ignored at every red flag, every casual cruelty, every moment he'd made me feel small. Never again. The certainty crystallized in my chest like ice. I'd been given an impossible second chance, and I would not waste it. When I finished the exam 3 hours early, I walked out into the bright Chengdu sunshine and took my first deep breath in what felt like a lifetime. The air smelled like street food and jasmine and possibility. I would never speak his language again. Not in the way I had before. Apologetic, grateful, diminished. If Marcus Chen wanted to find me in this life, he'd have to earn it. And I knew with absolute certainty that I would never give him the chance. The years that followed required patience I hadn't known I possessed. I could have changed everything immediately, avoided the scholarship to America, chosen a different path entirely. But I'd learned something in my first life about the importance of timing, about building power carefully and strategically. And I had something Marcus had never had, would never have. I remembered the future. I knew which companies would rise and which would fall. I knew which investments would pay off and which would collapse. I knew exactly how the world would change over the next 17 years, and I intended to use every single piece of that knowledge. But first, I had to build my foundation here, in my homeland, where I belonged. I graduated top of my class from Beijing Normal University with a degree in classical literature, exactly as before. But this time, when the scholarship offers came from American universities, I turned them all down. Instead, I accepted a position at my grandmother's urging with a small tech company in Shenzhen, one I knew would become a giant in the next decade. I worked there for 2 years, living cheaply, saving aggressively, and building relationships with the founders. I used my knowledge of technology trends to make suggestions that seemed brilliant in their prescience. The founders noticed. By year 3, they'd made me a junior partner. And when the company went public 5 years later, my stake made me wealthy beyond my previous life's imagination. But money was never the only goal. The goal was independence. The goal was never needing anyone to give me a better life again. I invested carefully, diversifying into real estate, tech stocks I knew would soar, strategic partnerships. I learned everything I could about business and finance, subjects I'd barely touched in my previous life, too focused on literature and translation. I made connections with powerful people, but this time I kept my own name on every deed, every contract, every agreement. My parents watched my success with confused pride. They'd expected me to follow the traditional path, university, maybe a gentle academic career, then marriage to a nice boy, children, domestic life. Instead, Their daughter had become someone they barely recognized, sharp, driven, ruthless in business. My grandmother understood, though. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me with ancient eyes, as if she knew something fundamental had changed in me. She'd hold my hand and say, "Good, Leonor, make yourself so strong that no one can bend you." If only she knew how literal that was. By age 25 in this life, the age I'd met Marcus in the last, I was a vice president at one of China's fastest-growing tech firms. I'd published 2 books on classical poetry that had become surprise bestsellers, bridging ancient and modern Chinese culture in ways that resonated with young people. I was regularly featured in business magazines, invited to speak at conferences, courted by venture capitalists. I still had my accent, of course, my Chengdu accent in Mandarin, my Chinese accent in English. But now they were marks of authenticity, of cultural pride. Foreign partners found me refreshingly genuine in a world of polished corporate speak. Young Chinese professionals saw me as someone who'd succeeded without abandoning her roots. I'd reclaimed my voice, and it had made me powerful. Jennifer, she still insisted on that name, had taken a different path in this timeline too. Without my embarrassing presence in America to compare herself against, she'd actually moved to China after college, chasing some fantasy of exotic expat life. She worked for a luxury brand in Shanghai, dating a series of Western men, trying desperately to distinguish herself as not like other Chinese girls. We barely spoke. My parents had slowly, painfully come to terms with my unconventional success. My mother still occasionally mentioned grandchildren and marriage, but my father had begun introducing me as my daughter, the entrepreneur, with unmistakable pride. And Marcus? I'd kept careful track of him over the years, the way you track a past predator to ensure it never returns. He'd gone to business school as he had in the previous timeline, landed a job with the State Department, married young to a white woman from his Connecticut hometown. They'd divorced within 3 years. He'd remarried at 29, another Chinese-American woman, I noted with grim amusement, and was now stationed in Beijing as a mid-level trade liaison. I'd successfully avoided every conference, every event, every occasion where we might have met. It wasn't hard. I moved in different circles now, occupied different spaces, until the day I couldn't avoid him anymore. The reception was being held at the Forbidden City's Eastern Wing, a cultural celebration accompanying the latest round of U.S.-China trade negotiations. As one of China's prominent young business leaders and cultural ambassadors, I'd been personally invited by the Ministry of Commerce. Declining would have been professionally unthinkable. I'd known Marcus would be there. He was part of the American delegation, after all. But I'd prepared myself, armed with 17 years of memory and 10 years of power built in this timeline. I wore a kipao again. I'd never stopped wearing them, had never let anyone make me feel ashamed of traditional dress. This one was deep blue silk with hand-embroidered phoenixes, custom-made by a master craftsman. My hair was up in an elegant twist, my grandmother's jade bracelet on my wrist. I looked successful, confident, undeniably Chinese. I looked like myself. The Americans arrived fashionably late, and I was deep in conversation with the cultural minister, the same one from my previous life, when I heard that familiar voice behind me, speaking atrocious Mandarin. "Thank you so much for hosting us. Your city is beautiful." I didn't turn, didn't react. The minister and I continued our discussion of Song Dynasty poetry, and I felt Marcus's presence move past me without recognition. Why would he recognize me? We'd never met in this timeline. I was just another Chinese businesswoman at a diplomatic function. Nothing special, nothing memorable. Except that an hour later, his colleague introduced us. "Mr. Chen, I'd like you to meet Zhou Lian, Vice President of Dongfang Tech and author of Ancient Voices, Modern Dreams." "Ms. Zhou, this is Marcus Chen from our trade delegation." I turned slowly, a polite smile fixed on my face, and watched his eyes light up with opportunistic interest. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition of my importance, my usefulness to his career. "Ms. Zhou," he said in English, extending his hand, "it's an honor. I've heard impressive things about your work." I took his hand briefly, professionally, and responded in Mandarin. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I hope you're enjoying Beijing." His Mandarin was worse than I remembered. No years of being corrected by me, no translator wife to smooth his edges. He stumbled through a response, clearly hoping I'd switch to English to make it easier for him. I didn't. I kept every response in Mandarin, speaking at a normal pace with my natural Chengdu accent, watching him struggle and sweat. The other Chinese professionals around us noticed, their eyes flickering with amusement at this American with a Chinese name who couldn't speak the language properly. Finally, he gave up and switched to English. "I'm sorry, my Mandarin isn't very strong yet. Would you mind?" "Of course," I said, also in English. But I let my Chinese accent come through fully, making no effort to smooth or hide it. "I understand. Language learning is difficult." Something flickered in his eyes. Was it condescension? Pity? The same look I'd seen in my previous life when he'd thought I was beneath him? "Your English is excellent," he said, the compliment somehow feeling like an insult. "Did you study in America?" "No," I said simply. I studied in Beijing. I've built my career here." "Really? That's unusual. Most Chinese professionals in your position have international experience." I smiled, sharp as a knife. "I prefer to build from a position of cultural strength, Mr. Chen. The world comes to China now. We don't need to chase it anymore." His wife appeared then. I'd researched her, of course. Sarah Chen, born Shuling Wang, another woman who'd Americanized herself desperately. She wore a cocktail dress that was slightly too formal for the occasion. Her hair dyed light brown, her makeup applied in the American style. She looked uncomfortable among the other Chinese attendees in their mix of traditional and modern dress. "Marcus," she said in English, her own Chinese accent nearly eradicated, "we should go congratulate the ambassador." "Of course, Ms. Zhou, it was interesting to meet you." "Likewise," I said in Mandarin, watching Sarah's face tighten at the language she'd clearly worked hard to forget. They walked away, and I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, no residual attraction. Just a distant sense of satisfaction that I'd robbed him of the opportunity to ever hurt me again. The minister beside me chuckled softly. "That man's Mandarin is atrocious. How did he get a posting to Beijing?" "American exceptionalism," I said dryly, and we both laughed. But the encounter wasn't over. Over the following weeks, Marcus kept appearing at events I attended. At first, I thought it was coincidence. We moved in overlapping professional circles, after all. But then I noticed the pattern. He was seeking me out. His emails started arriving. Professional at first, requests for coffee to discuss cultural exchange opportunities, invitations to dinners with other Chinese-American business leaders, suggestions that we collaborate on trade initiatives. I ignored most of them, responded to others with polite deflections. He persisted. Finally, 6 weeks after our first meeting, he cornered me at a book signing for my newest poetry collection. He'd actually bought a copy. I saw it tucked under his arm, probably unreadable to him since it was entirely in Chinese. "Ms. Zhou," he said, slightly out of breath as if he'd rushed to catch me. I've been hoping to talk with you more. I think we have a lot in common." I raised an eyebrow. "Do we?" "Well, yes, we're both Chinese American. Say, I'm Chinese," I corrected gently. "I've never been American." He blinked, recalibrating. "Right, of course. I meant we both bridge two cultures. I think that gives us unique perspective." I studied him for a moment. This man who'd destroyed me in another life without even realizing it. He was handsome still. I could see that objectively. Tall for a Chinese man, with good features and an expensive suit. But his confidence was performative, insecure beneath the surface. He needed validation constantly. Needed to be the smartest person in the room, the most successful, the most Chinese when it served him, and the most American when that was better. He was exhausting. "Mr. Chen," I said carefully, I appreciate your interest in my work, but I'm very busy. Perhaps we can connect when your Mandarin improves enough for you to read my books in their original language." His face flushed. Of course, I'm working on my Mandarin. It's just, priorities with the job. I understand. Language learning takes dedication. Good evening." I walked away, and this time he didn't follow. My sister arrived in Beijing 3 months later, divorced and desperate. She'd married her latest Western boyfriend, a British banker, in a whirlwind romance that had lasted exactly 14 months before he'd left her for his secretary. She'd lost her job at the luxury brand after a corporate restructuring that coincidentally coincided with China's government cracking down on foreign luxury companies' treatment of Chinese staff. At 31, she was broke, jobless, and running out of options. She called me from the airport, her voice small in a way I'd never heard before. "Leanne, I need help." I almost said no, almost told her to figure it out herself the way she'd always told me to just adapt when I'd struggled in my previous life. But I wasn't her. I wasn't the person who returned cruelty for cruelty. I was the person who'd learned from pain and chosen to be stronger. "Come to my office tomorrow," I said. "We'll talk." She showed up in a designer dress that was 3 years out of fashion, her hair still dyed light brown, looking lost. My assistant served her tea in my corner office overlooking Beijing's skyline, and I watched her take in the evidence of my success with wide, disbelieving eyes. "You did all this?" she whispered. "Yes." "But how? You were always so—" "You never wanted to change, to adapt." "I never wanted to erase myself," I corrected. "There's a difference." She flinched. We sat in silence for a long moment. "What do you need, Jennifer?" I asked finally, deliberately using her chosen name. She stopped, started again. "I need a job, and maybe a place to stay while I get back on my feet. Mom and Dad's place is too small, and I can't afford—" "I can offer you both," I said. "But there are conditions." Her head snapped up, defensive. "I'm not a charity Kate." "No, you're my sister. And I remember when we were children, before you decided that being Chinese was something to be ashamed of. I remember when we used to speak Mandarin together and you'd help me with my calligraphy homework." I leaned forward. "The person I'm offering help to is my sister Jing, not Jennifer." She stared at me. "You want me to change my name back?" "I want you to stop running from who you are. You can work for my company. We need someone with international marketing experience. You can stay in my guest house. But you need to relearn your language, reconnect with your culture. Not for me, for yourself." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know if I can. I've spent so long trying to be someone else." "I know," I said softly. "But you can't build a real life on a fake foundation. Trust me on this." She did cry then, and I let her. When she finally composed herself, she whispered, "Okay, I'll try." "Good, you start Monday." It wasn't easy for her. She struggled with Mandarin lessons, felt awkward at company events, often slipped back into her Americanized mannerisms. But slowly, painfully, I watched my sister come back to herself. Her hair grew out to its natural black. She started wearing qipaos to formal events. She enrolled in calligraphy classes and attended cultural lectures. 6 months after she started working for me, she came to my office with tears in her eyes and said, "I want to change my name back, legally, to Zhou Jing." I hugged her for the first time in over a decade, and that's when Marcus Chen's wife filed for divorce. The news spread through Beijing's expatriate community like wildfire. Sarah Chen had apparently caught him having an affair with a junior staffer, a white woman from Nebraska, interestingly enough. The divorce was messy and public, with allegations of financial misconduct and emotional abuse flying from both sides. I learned all this from Jing, who'd started dating a lawyer who worked on international divorces. She came to my apartment one evening with wine and gossip. "You'll never believe who's getting divorced," she said, pouring us both glasses. "Remember that American guy who kept trying to network with you, Marcus Chen?" I kept my face neutral. "Oh?" "Apparently he's been cheating on his wife for months. But here's the really crazy part. She's claiming he was financially abusive, made her put everything in his name, controlled all their money, even though she was the one with family wealth." Jing shook her head. "Remind you of anyone?" She didn't know, couldn't know, but the parallel was so exact it made my breath catch. "That's terrible," I managed. "He's been coming around more, apparently, to events and stuff. Beijing says he's trying to rebuild his reputation, make new connections." She gave me a meaningful look. "He's been asking about you, specifically." "Has he?" Yep, wants an introduction. Thinks maybe a real Chinese businesswoman could help him understand the culture better or something. She rolled her eyes. I told Beijing absolutely not. The guy gives me weird vibes. Good instincts, I said quietly. But Marcus didn't need my sister's boyfriend to make an introduction. 3 weeks later, he showed up at a charity gala I was hosting for rural education initiatives, one of my pet projects, funded by my company and several partners. He'd changed since our last meeting, looked older, more worn. The divorce was taking its toll, but he'd also become more desperate, more determined. He bypassed all the normal channels and approached me directly during the cocktail hour. Ms. Zhou, I've been hoping to speak with you. I turned slowly, taking in his rumpled tuxedo, his too eager expression. Mr. Chen, this is a private event. I know, I contributed to your foundation. I wanted to talk to you about a potential partnership. Liar. I'd seen the donor list. His name wasn't on it. I'm quite busy tonight, as you can see. I gestured to the room full of guests. Please, just 5 minutes. I promise it will be worth your time. Something in his voice, a edge of pleading, of genuine desperation, made me pause. In my previous life, I would have felt sympathy, would have given him what he wanted because I was conditioned to make things easier for him, but this wasn't my previous life. You can schedule an appointment with my assistant, I said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a speech to give. I walked away and gave a speech about the importance of education and cultural preservation, about how we couldn't abandon rural communities to chase Western ideas of progress, about how real strength came from honoring your roots while building toward the future. The applause was thunderous. Donors pledged millions, and Marcus Chen stood at the back of the room, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He did schedule that appointment, and then he showed up to it. My assistant showed him into my office on a Thursday afternoon. He looked better than he had at the gala, cleaner, more put together, but there was still that edge of desperation underneath. Mr. Chen, I said, not inviting him to sit, what can I do for you? He sat anyway, uninvited. I wanted to apologize for my behavior at the gala. I've been under a lot of stress with the divorce, and I'm sure that's difficult, I said, my tone making it clear I didn't particularly care. But I'm not a therapist, Mr. Chen. I'm a businesswoman. If you don't have a business proposition, I'm afraid I can't help you. He flinched at my coldness, then seemed to recalibrate. Actually, I do. I'm thinking of leaving the State Department, opening a consulting firm focused on U.S.-China business relations. I think someone with your connections and cultural expertise would be an invaluable partner. I stared at him. He wanted me to help him make money off my culture, my connections, my expertise, and he thought I'd be grateful for the opportunity. It was my previous life all over again, except this time he wasn't even offering marriage. Just partnership. Just use of my skills for his benefit. I see, I said slowly. And what would you bring to this partnership? Well, I have connections in D.C., understand American business culture, have experience navigating government relations. So you want me to provide Chinese market access, cultural expertise, established business relationships, and probably funding, while you provide… What, exactly? The ability to speak English natively. I let the derision creep into my voice. Mr. Chen, I hate to break this to you, but your value proposition is severely lacking. His face went red. I have years of diplomatic experience, mid-level diplomatic experience in a role you clearly got not through Chinese language proficiency, which you demonstrably lack, but through family connections or diversity hiring initiatives. You're getting divorced, which means you're probably about to become financially unstable. And you have a reputation, Mr. Chen. I make it my business to know who I'm dealing with. What reputation? He demanded. That you take credit for others' work. That you use people. That you married your wife for her money and connections, and then treated her terribly once you had what you needed. I leaned forward. Did you really think I'd want to partner with someone like that? He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So, you don't know what you're talking about. Sarah she's lying about everything. I'm sure she is. I said, my voice dripping with false sympathy. Just like I'm sure every other person you've used and discarded was lying too. I came here in good faith. You came here because you're desperate and you think I'm an easy target. A real Chinese businesswoman who doesn't know better, who will be flattered by the attention of an American with a Chinese face. I stood as well, drawing myself up to my full height. But I do know better, Mr. Chen. I know exactly what you are. For just a moment, one brief, shining moment, I saw recognition flash across his face. Not memory, but something deeper. As if some part of him remembered a life where he'd done exactly this to someone else. Then it was gone, replaced by anger. You're making a mistake, he said. I could have helped you break into the American market. I don't need your help to break into any market, Mr. Chen. I've built something here that doesn't require validation from people like you. Now please leave my office and don't come back. He left, slamming the door hard enough that my assistant peeked in to check on me. I'm fine, I assured her, but I'm just taking out the trash. The rumors started 3 days later. Someone was spreading word through Beijing's business community that I was difficult to work with, anti-American, too traditional to be a real global player. The whispers were subtle but persistent, designed to undermine my credibility with international partners. I knew who was behind it, of course. Marcus Chen, petty in his rejection, trying to damage what he couldn't control. It might have worked, too, if I hadn't spent years building unshakable relationships. If I wasn't sitting on a pile of successful projects and happy partners, if I wasn't one of the most respected voices in Chinese tech and culture. Instead, the rumors just made him look desperate. The cultural minister, who'd become a genuine friend over the years, called me personally. I've been hearing strange things about you from some of the American delegation. Marcus Chen? How did you know? He approached me about a partnership. I declined. He didn't take it well. A long pause. That man is poison, Lian. He's been trying to use his position to make business connections, asking for inappropriate favors, implying he has influence he doesn't possess. We've been considering requesting his recall. I think that's wise, I said carefully. Would you be willing to provide a statement about his attempted partnership and subsequent behavior? Would I? Would I actively destroy Marcus Chen's career, end his time in Beijing, force him back to America in disgrace? In my previous life, I would have hesitated, would have worried about being too harsh, about ruining his life, about whether I was being fair. But this wasn't my previous life, and I'd learned something crucial. Being kind to cruel people doesn't make you noble. It just makes you a victim. Yes, I said. I'll provide a statement. The recall happened quickly after that. Apparently, I wasn't the only person Marcus had tried to manipulate or use. A half-dozen other business leaders provided similar statements. His boss at the State Department was mortified. Within 6 weeks, Marcus Chen was on a plane back to D.C., his career in tatters, his consulting dreams dead before they started. I felt no guilt, only relief that I'd stopped him before he could do to someone else what he'd done to me. My grandmother died on a spring morning 5 years later, peacefully in her sleep at age 93. I was with her, holding her hand when she took her last breath. She'd been unconscious for 3 days, but in the moment before she passed, her eyes opened and focused on me with perfect clarity. "Leonor," she whispered, "you came back." My blood ran cold. "Grandma?" "I knew, the day of your exam, you came back to us." She smiled, her grip surprisingly strong on my hand. "I'm so glad. You deserved better than what you had." "You knew?" I could barely breathe. "All this time?" A grandmother knows her granddaughter's soul. "You were so sad that day, so lost. And then afterward, so fierce." Her thumb rubbed across my jade bracelet. "You've done well. You've been true to yourself. That's all I ever wanted for you." "I don't know what I'll do without you," I whispered. You'll keep being exactly who you are. Strong, proud, Chinese. She pronounced the last word with emphasis, in Mandarin with her thick Chengdu accent. Never let anyone make you ashamed of that again. I won't, I promise. She closed her eyes, still smiling. Good girl, now let me rest. She was gone before I could say goodbye. The funeral was enormous. It seemed everyone whose life I'd touched over the past 15 years came to pay respects. My parents, aged and grieving, Jing, who'd become my fiercest supporter and closest friend, business partners, employees, poets, politicians, students I'd mentored. I gave the eulogy entirely in Mandarin, speaking of my grandmother's strength, her wisdom, her unshakable sense of self. I spoke of how she'd raised me to be proud of my heritage, to never abandon my language or my culture for the sake of fitting in. She taught me, I said, my voice carrying over the assembled crowd, that you can honor your roots while reaching for the sky, that being authentically yourself is not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all, and that speaking your truth in your own voice is worth more than any acceptance you might gain by staying silent. I scattered her ashes in the garden she'd tended for 40 years, returned to Chengdu soil, and felt something in my chest finally, fully heal. 10 years after my rebirth, Dongfang Tech went public on both the Shanghai and New York stock exchanges. My personal stake was valued at just over $3 billion. I was 36 years old, one of the wealthiest women in China, and one of the most influential voices in technology and cultural preservation. My foundation had built 200 schools in rural China. My books were required reading in universities. I was regularly invited to advise government policy on cultural exchange and technology development. I'd never married, never even come close. I'd dated occasionally men who respected my success, who found my accent charming rather than embarrassing, who never once suggested I should be anyone other than who I was. But I'd never felt the need to settle down, to make myself smaller to fit into someone else's life. I was whole on my own. Jing had flourished too. She'd risen to be vice president of international marketing, had published her own book on cultural authenticity and global branding, had married her lawyer boyfriend in a traditional Chinese ceremony. She'd legally changed her name back to Zhou Jing and was teaching her children Mandarin from birth. I wasted so much time, she told me once at a family dinner, being ashamed of who I was. You found your way back, I said, and that's what matters. My parents, now in their 70s, had finally accepted that their daughters had turned out well despite, or perhaps because of, refusing to follow the expected path. Father often showed my picture from magazine covers to his friends. My mother had stopped asking about grandchildren and started asking about my next book. We were healing, all of us. I thought I'd never hear from or about Marcus Chen again. He'd faded into obscurity, back to America. Last I'd heard working some mid-level corporate job in California. His divorce had been finalized years ago. His career had never recovered from the Beijing scandal. I'd won completely and totally, and I'd done it without him even knowing he was in a competition. But then I received an invitation to speak at an international business conference in San Francisco. The topic was cultural identity in global business. I was the keynote speaker. I almost declined. I'd successfully avoided America for 25 years, built my entire empire without ever setting foot in the country that had once seemed so important, so necessary. But that was the point, wasn't it? I'd been so afraid of America in my previous life, so desperate to prove I belonged there. And that desperation had destroyed me. I wasn't desperate anymore. I accepted the invitation. The conference was massive, held at the Moscone Center with thousands of attendees from around the world. I was scheduled to speak on the main stage in front of an audience of over 5,000 people. The organizers were thrilled to have me. I was exactly the kind of authentic voice they wanted to showcase. I wore a kipao, of course, deep red silk with gold embroidery, custom made by the same craftsman who'd made my grandmother's funeral dress. I wore her jade bracelet. I wore my Chengdu accent with pride, and I walked onto that stage like I owned it, because I did. My speech was about the danger of cultural erasure in pursuit of success, about the importance of maintaining your identity even, especially, in global spaces. I spoke about young Chinese professionals who felt they had to Americanize themselves to compete. I spoke about the toxic myth that Western was better, that American was more professional, that accents were something to be ashamed of. I have an accent when I speak English, I told the crowd, letting my Chinese pronunciation come through clearly. I have an accent when I speak Mandarin too. I'm from Chengdu, and you can hear it. And I spent a long time thinking I should hide that, soften it, make myself more palatable to people who wanted me to sound like them. But here's what I learned. Your accent is proof that you know more than one language. Your different pronunciation is evidence of the rich complexity of your experience. And anyone who makes you feel ashamed of those things is not someone who deserves access to your skills, your intelligence, or your culture. Build from a position of strength, honor where you come from, and never, ever let anyone convince you that being yourself is an embarrassment. The applause was deafening. Standing ovation. People were crying, and in Mays, the third row I saw him. Marcus Chen, older now, his hair going gray at the temples, wearing a suit that was just a little too cheap for this crowd. He was staring at me with an expression of shocked recognition. Not of my face, he still didn't know me, but of the message. After my speech, after the meet and greet, after the awards dinner, I was walking through the hotel lobby when he approached me. I saw him coming and could have avoided him, could have ducked into the elevator, been spirited away by my assistant. But I'd faced him in Beijing. I could face him here. "Ms. Zhou," he said, and his voice was hesitant, uncertain. That speech it was incredible. Thank you. I wonder if I could talk to you for a moment about what you said. I gestured to the hotel bar and we sat at a quiet corner table. I ordered tea, he ordered whiskey. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said finally. "In my life, in my career, with people." "I see." "Your speech made me think about someone I knew. A long time ago. My first wife, actually." He stared into his drink. "I treated her terribly. Made her feel like she wasn't good enough, like her accent was embarrassing, like she should be grateful I married her. And she was brilliant, kind. She deserved so much better than me." My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral. "What happened to her?" "She died. Heart attack. She was only 32. He looked up at me and there were tears in his eyes. And I never apologized. Never even realized how badly I'd hurt her until she was gone. "That's unfortunate," I said, my voice carefully even. "I've thought about her every day since, wondering if she'd still be alive if I'd been better to her. If the stress I put her under contributed to her death." He wiped his eyes. "Listening to you tonight, I thought, that's who she should have been. Confident, proud, unashamed. And I stole that from her." I took a sip of my tea, letting the silence stretch between us. "Mr. Chen," I said finally, "I think you're giving yourself too much credit, both for your influence and your guilt. People survive much worse than bad marriages. They build new lives. They become who they were meant to be, with or without the people who tried to diminish them." He frowned, confused. "But she's dead. You said she died at 32. That's a tragedy. But her life before that, maybe it was exactly what she needed. Maybe she was learning lessons that made her, in her final years, finally understand her own worth." I leaned forward. "Maybe she died knowing that she deserved better than you. And maybe that's enough." His face went pale. That's a harsh thing to say." "Is it? You treated her badly. She deserved better. Those are both things you've acknowledged. Why shouldn't she have known it too?" I wish I could apologize. Tell her I'm sorry." I stood, gathering my things. "Mr. Chen, apologies are for the living. The dead don't need them. What you should do is become someone who wouldn't make the same mistakes. Become someone worthy of the kindness you were given. That's the only real apology." I walked away, and this time I didn't look back. Because I didn't need his apology, didn't need his regret or his growth or his redemption arc. I'd already won. I returned to Beijing 3 days later to my penthouse overlooking the city, to my company and my foundation and my books and my life. Jing Jing came over that evening with her children, my nephew and niece, 8 and 6, already fluent in Mandarin and English, being raised to be proud of both sides of their heritage. Auntie Lian, my nephew said in Mandarin, Mom says you gave a really good speech in America. I did, I confirmed. Will you teach me to give speeches too? Of course, in Mandarin or English. Both, he declared. Aspan. I want to sound like me in every language. I hugged him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, feeling my heart swell with something like hope. That's perfect. You should always sound like yourself. After they left, I stood on my balcony and looked out over Beijing's glittering skyline. Somewhere out there were thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, whose lives I'd touched through my businesses, my foundation, my books. Young women who'd heard my speeches and decided not to change their names, not to hide their accents, not to make themselves smaller for anyone's comfort. I'd built an empire on being authentically myself, and in doing so, I'd become someone my grandmother would be proud of, someone I was proud of. My phone buzzed with a message from my assistant. The contract from the New York publisher came through. They want 3 more books. Also, the Cultural Ministry confirmed, you're being honored at next month's ceremony. I smiled and replied, excellent. Draft the contract response in Mandarin, they can translate. Because that was the final lesson I'd learned. The world could meet me where I was. I didn't need to go to them anymore. I'd spent my first life speaking Marcus Chen's language, apologetic, diminished, grateful for crumbs. After Rebirth, I never spoke his language again. I spoke my own. And it turned out my voice, my accent, my authentic self was worth more than anything I'd ever tried to be before. I was Zhou Lian, born in Chengdu, raised by a grandmother who taught me to be proud, successful beyond measure, uncompromisingly myself. I was home, I was whole, I was free, and I'd never been happier.